On the 20th anniversary of the 7/7 bombings, the Telegraph has gone in search of the wife and alleged accomplice of one of the killers, Samantha Lewthwaite, otherwise known as the White Widow.
I've been looking at what happened to her after 7/7, what she's done in the intervening 20 years, and I've been speaking to some of the people who have spent that time trying to track her down. You have this sort of slight mysticism building up around her. She's this sort of character who seems to pop up at these terrorist attacks, but was she really there? Was she not? Was it somebody else? You know, was she the one pulling the strings in the background? Who knows? So she becomes a great propaganda tool for Al-Shabaab because she's almost this sort of unkillable, sort of phantom.
Breaking news we're getting from the PA Newswire that there's been reports of an explosion outside Liverpool Street Station. That, of course, in the East End of London. It's the bordering area. You'll be maybe familiar with the Swiss building known as the Gherkin, which, of course, has been a familiar landmark throughout London for the past sort of couple of years or so. That's very close to Liverpool Street Station. They're getting this reports of an explosion from the British Transport Police.
Yeah, no more information at the moment. No details of whether the police had been informed of a warning. Of course, it comes just after the rush hour ended, 9 o'clock. Most people at work probably by now, but emergency services, so assuming the fire brigade, ambulance service as well, and indeed British Transport Police are going to London's Liverpool Street Station after reports there of an explosion.
I was working that day, and I was sent to, quite soon afterwards, I was sent to Leeds, where several of the bombers were from. And we sort of quite quickly built up a picture of several of them. But Germaine Lindsay, who was living in Aylesbury, who was the fourth bomber and married to Samantha Lewthwaite, it took us a while to sort of find him and find out about him. And what was striking was that both he and his wife, Lewthwaite, were Muslim converts, whereas the others had been born into Muslim families.
He was of Jamaican descent.
He was Jamaican originally. His mother had converted.
Right.
He then became a Muslim himself. So I distinctly remember one of my colleagues getting the first picture of the two of them, and you had this guy, this black guy, and a white woman, sort of smiling into the camera. So it was pretty obvious that there was something very different about those two. So we obviously we became interested in her as well as him at the time, and she was a fascinating person really, because she'd been born in Northern Ireland in 1983. Her father had served in the army, where he'd met his wife, and then they moved to Aylesbury when she was a child. She went to just normal local schools, very much a sort of normal kid, until she was about 11, and then her parents divorced, and that seemed to have been a bit of a sort of fork in the road for her. She became very friendly with a family who lived nearby who were Muslims. Spent a lot of time with them. Seemed to somehow find that sort of strong family sort of ethic comforting, perhaps. And then eventually announced to her parents that she wanted to convert to Islam, which she did when she was 17.
Right. And then she marries this guy very young.
Yeah, so she, the family that she became friendly with were not in any way extreme. They were a very normal, moderate Muslim family. She, though, seems to have become attracted to going to some of the mosques in London, which, I'm sure you remember at the time, some of them were dominated by some of these hate preachers like Abu Hamza, the one everybody remembers. She seems to have then come under the influence of a chap called Abdullah El Faisal, who was born Trevor Forrest, also a Jamaican convert. And he had also become friendly with Germaine Lindsay, who was actually younger than Lewthwaite. And he put them in touch with each other. They then emailed each other, arranged to meet at a Stop the War march in 2002, and then they were married within weeks of meeting each other in an Islamic ceremony in his front room.
And this seems to be a pattern in her life where these marriages are, if not quite arranged, they're sort of supervised by a religious figure.
Yeah.
So it's almost as if she was being drawn into this world through the marriages. It wasn't just that she met someone and fell in love. It's that actually the marriage is part and parcel of her radicalism and her religion.
Yes, although I think she had already become somewhat radicalised before she married Lindsay, because she seems to have come under into the orbit of this Abdullah al-Faisal character, who she later used to visit when he was in prison after the bombings. He was in prison for terrorist offences. So we get to the day of the bombings, obviously, and Germaine Lindsay was only 19 when he carried out the suicide attack.
And did they have children? Sorry, by that point.
And she was 8 months pregnant.
8 months, right?
And she, when the police started looking into this afterwards, she seemed to be fully aware of the fact that he was going to go and do this.
Right.
She didn't report him missing for 6 days, which is pretty peculiar. And when they went into the house and started gathering evidence, they found that she'd been using his phone like it was her own phone, which apparently she'd never done before. She would normally never touch his phone. Right. So from the moment of the bombings,
she had an inkling he wasn't coming back.
Exactly. And also they found out that she had spent time in the company of all of the bombers. She'd gone to Leeds with him. They'd had meetings in Leeds where all the bombers were there. So there doesn't seem to be any doubt as to her knowledge, her prior knowledge.
But she did an interview with a newspaper, right, claiming that she didn't. And this, again, is another element I find really interesting, is her capacity for lying.
Yeah. Well, she's not a very good liar, I don't think. She did an interview with The Sun. They paid her about £30,000 at the time. She claimed that she was a victim as well, because she'd been made a widow and her child, who had been born by then, had no father. And it was all fairly sort of, obvious platitudes that she was saying. And when the police interviewed her, they very quickly worked out that her story just didn't stack up. She couldn't really back anything up. And I think it got to her. No, she was treated as a witness to begin with. I had a long chat with a chap called David Vidachete, who was a Scotland Yard counter-terrorism intelligence officer, now retired. And he spent a long time either interviewing or sitting in on interviews with her. And I think he said it got to a point where she realised that they'd worked her out, and it was a case of, what are you going to do about it? So he was very frustrated. He wanted to arrest her. He felt that there was plenty of evidence that she was cognizant of the attacks at the very least, and probably encouraged them. He tells a story of basically the security services sort of getting in the way of that, as far as he's concerned. That the security services, he feels, wanted to keep her out there, monitor her, in keeping with several other people that they thought were accomplices. But a lot of those people did get arrested eventually, sometime later, and she wasn't. And he's never quite understood why she was treated slightly differently, perhaps because the security services wanted to, they thought she was going to lead them to a big fish, but she didn't. She led them a merry dance, really.
Yes, I mean, she may have led them to a big fish eventually, but they obviously didn't monitor her that well, because the story continues, does it not? Yeah,
I mean, she then decided to take herself off to Southern Africa after she had been put in touch with another Islamist extremist called Fahmy Salim, again by her old friend Abdullah al-Faisal, the chap who had put her in touch with Lindsay. She got in touch with this guy. She went to South Africa, and I think they married more or less the next day after she arrived.
Love at first sight.
Exactly.
With her child in tow?
With 2 children in tow, yeah. She'd had 2 children by now. And then she had 2 more children quite soon after that. And it was a sort of a similar pattern. She seemed to have settled down. And by the way, she came back to England to have one of those children because the good old NHS.
Oh, the NHS.
Oh, yes.
The system works.
Yes, of course. But of course, she wasn't at that point, or at any point really, under an arrest warrant. So she was free to come and go. Yeah. Needless to say, she came back, had a baby on the NHS, and then went back to carry on with
our NHS.
Our NHS in England, in Aylesbury, at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. and then went back to Africa to carry on spending her time with terrorists.
But again, an opportunity missed.
Yeah.
Where you'd think there would be a sort of flag on her.
You'd think it was an open goal, really, that she was presenting to the police, but we don't. Nobody quite knows why she was treated this way. Whether, I just don't know whether she was some sort of deep state informant or they thought she was, and she was double. Who knows? You never really find out the truth about these things, do you? But anyway, so she came. She went back to South Africa. Seemed to be settling down, lived what appeared to be a fairly normal life, got a job, arranged through, as it happens, contacts that she'd made in the terrorism world. Well, she was working in a food factory as a sort of supervisor, which seems to have been probably a sort of just a cover, to make her look respectable. Lived in quite a middle class neighbourhood, but all the while, this husband of hers was sort of disappearing for long periods. Doing goodness knows what, I think we can guess, and then it eventually it appears that she started taking part in some of the terrorist attacks that he and his group Al-Shabaab were involved in Kenya, including, well, there are 4 particular attacks that she has been associated with, which altogether claimed the lives of 240 people. To what extent she was involved is very hard to pin down, because there are very conflicting accounts. There are eyewitnesses who said they saw her. The police say the opposite in many cases, that they've looked at all the CCTV of some of those incidents. She's not there. But so you have this sort of slight mysticism building up around her. She's this sort of character who seems to pop up at these terrorist attacks. But was she really there? Was she not? Was it somebody else? Was she the one pulling the strings in the background? Who knows? So she becomes a great propaganda tool for Al-Shabaab, because she's almost this sort of unkillable, sort of phantom, that's out there.
And once someone gets a nickname, then
one secret is exactly. She becomes the White Widow, and then she becomes the sort of the bogeyman.
But again, there was an opportunity, was there not, to catch her in 2011?
That's right.
When the police actually knocked on her door.
That's
and
right.
She just claimed to be someone else.
She did.
Living under a different name,
yes.
Claimed to be that person, so they said, oh, you're not the right person, and they just walked away.
That's right. So she seemed to have been able to get hold of a South African identity card via a corrupt official in the name of Natalie Webb. Natalie Webb is a real person. She's a British nurse. And she effectively stole her identity via this corrupt official. That enabled her to get a South African passport, which meant she could travel around within Africa, which she did. Anyway, the police, after one of the attacks that she was certainly suspected of involvement in, raided an address that they believed was connected to her, and they knocked on the door. A woman answered the door. They said, oh, hello, we're looking for, I presume they said, we're looking for Samantha Lewthwaite. Who are you? She said, I'm Natalie Webb. And they said, well, can we have a look in the house? Yes, come in, by all means. Probably made them a cup of tea, who knows? Was very polite to them, and they sort of said, thank you very much. Went back to the police station, quite quickly realised that they'd made a huge mistake, that they'd been hoodwinked. Went back, she'd fled. And they found a bunch of stuff which showed that it was Samantha Lewthwaite, including a computer that she'd left behind, various photographs, family pictures of her with her children, etc. And that was the last time anybody before us, well, since then, nobody has had a confirmed sighting of her, and that was 14 years ago now.
Some of that stuff that was left behind, you say in your report, suggests that she had quite a girly personality. Yeah,
she's this bizarre sort of mixture of hardened, determined jihadi and somebody who draws love hearts all over, doodles all over sort of shopping lists. And they found that she was listening to Beyonce and doing lots of sort of very normal stuff. And they found photos of her without her hijab on, where she looked like the sort of European girl she was born as, looking quite sort of almost like she'd taken some sort of modelling pictures of herself.
Yeah.
She's always trying to look quite glam. So really hard to get into the mindset of someone like that. Other than it, I think the one thing that you can take away from it is that we like to think of people who get involved in crime and terrorism as being these sort of one-dimensional characters. That's all they do, and then they're not. They scarily, they are, part of their personality is a regular person who does regular things and goes shopping and does all of those things that we do, but is also determined to kill people who disagree with them.
Yeah. Well, the brides who were drawn to ISIS, there was a lot of social media stuff that they put out, which suggested a sort of almost glamorous lifestyle of cars and things like that, and gorgeous, hunky martyrs you were going to marry, and you'd have slaves in your house and sort of thing. Actually, she's kind of normal in that sense. Here is a boring girl from Aylesbury who has found a religion that makes sense of her life, and then she is sucked into a cause that's not only greater than herself, but which is historic and religious in its significance. So, one thinks of people joining Baader Meinhof and the sort of cool terror groups of the 1970s, or even people working as Nazis. This ordinary people are very easily attracted to evil.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and particularly those examples you've just quoted. That an awful lot of people ended up being part of those movements, and murders were associated with them. They weren't all people who you would walk down the street and identify as crazy. So
no,
it's a
and one might say, putting on a sort of an anti-colonialist a hat here, is there a little bit of racism in our fixation on the fact that she was the white widow? That what makes her glamorous and stand out is that we expect terrorists to be brown, and here's one that's white. So the Western media has done its usual thing of turning the one white person into the exception and the person we all think about when...
Well, I suppose that the difference is that you would... it's easy to sort of assume that somebody who was born Muslim and has been brought up as a Muslim may have been indoctrinated from the word go, from their birth. Maybe that's easier for us to understand and to get our head round than somebody who was just the same as us until and when I say us I mean non-terrorists, until she was a certain age, and then suddenly sort of almost a switch flicks and she becomes this person intent on murder. It's impossible for normal people to understand how that happens.
Gordon, she hasn't been cited then since 2011.
Yeah.
But do we know? Are there any sort of glimmers of information about her? Do we know anything about her husband? Is he alive? And of course, some of her children are now adults, and some hold British passports. Is there any hint of anyone around her?
Yeah. Well, we think that her children are still with her in some capacity. I mean, she's 41 now. The best intelligence that we have from people on the ground who have sort of tried to track her is that she has been living in Somalia, in a part of Somalia that is very much controlled by Al-Shabaab, where you won't get within probably 100 miles of where she is without, encountering Al-Shabaab. Very difficult for any law enforcement agencies to get to, but the people we spoke to believe that she is living in she's married to someone who has a polygamous marriage, who has several wives, who is a member of Al-Shabaab, and that she's teaching in a sort of almost a sort of Al-Shabaab terrorist college, that she's teaching English to Somalian women, or perhaps even Kenyan women, in order that they can operate among Westerners in places like Kenya, possibly as honey traps, certainly as recruiters. So she can't. I think she can't really travel very easily now because she's so recognisable. But there is evidence that she's been sort of tutoring others to follow the same sort of path as her. There are also conflicting accounts that suggest she fled to Yemen because she fell out with her husband. Nobody seems to have any real evidence to back that up. It's just sort of floating in the ether.
And what about her family and friends here, who presumably, I mean, it's a difficult day for a lot of people today, but, for a moment in time, they had the world's media crawling all over them, a lot of questions, perhaps a sense that they didn't know this person at all anymore. It must, 20 years on, you think you might have put something behind you, but they have this great mystery of where she is and this sort of revisit of, I think by no means they're not the family who've had the most difficult time today, but it must be very strange for them. And I just wondered if there's been any public statement.
Well, we approached them. We approached her family. They didn't want to talk to us. And they've said very little over the years, other than one of her uncles said that he thought she was dead. Maybe easier for the family to sort of, cope with it if they believe she's dead. But the people that we spoke to who know the family don't think they've had any contact with her for a very long time now. So I think the family obviously just, hope they can get on with their lives and try to, well, you can't put it behind you, can you? But, that they can somehow just try and, live a peaceful life, sort of coping in their own way, I guess.
You talked a bit about the former Scotland Yard officer. Sorry, I've forgotten his name.
David Vidicete, yeah.
And it sounded like he had some criticism, say, of the security services.
Yes.
Using her case, I suppose, is a very strong example. Have there been a sort of lessons learned exercise? I hate the word inquiry, but has there been a sense that this can't happen again because we have there's been a lot of deep dive into the bombers themselves, but these interesting peripheral figures who some people believe don't have direct involvement, particularly with social media and so forth now, are actually quite a big piece of the puzzle. And have you had a sense from the sort of powers that be that these characters are now looked at differently with her story in mind?
Well, they will tell you that lessons have been learned, but I think it's interesting that almost every time we have a terrorist attack, as you know from your time in government, that almost always they have had some sort of inkling, or they've come across some of the characters when they've through intelligence, and almost always there is some form of criticism or admission that the various agencies weren't really talking to each other as much as they should have done, and they do have traditionally operated in silos a little bit. There is sometimes a bit of sort of professional mistrust or jealousy. I don't know what exactly you would characterize it as, but poor communication between the various parts of the security state just seems to be a factor in all of these things when they crop up. So I think they will say, oh yes, obviously we communicate much better, but I wouldn't want to put a huge amount of money on there not being some criticism if there's another terrorist attack, God forbid, that they weren't really quite talking to each other in the way they should have been.